Hello everyone, I am very glad that you're joining this story. Subscribe, like and comment. Enjoy the story, smile more often.
Imagine spending your whole life working twice as hard just to be noticed, and the moment you finally make it, your own father lifts a glass, not for you, but for your brother. The room laughs. You sit there, invisible again. But what they didn't know, that night wasn't just a promotion party. It was payback. Cold, calculated, and public. Hi there, I'm Claire. And if you think success is the best revenge, wait until you hear how I used mine. This isn't just a story about family betrayal, it's about taking back power when they least expect it. You ever get that feeling like you're watching your own life from the sidelines, waiting for someone to finally pull you into the center, only to realize no one ever planned to? That's what growing up felt like for me. It wasn't one big dramatic betrayal, not at first. It was 1,000 small dismissals, 1,000 subtle digs, 1,000 ways of being told without words that I didn't matter as much as my brother. Jason, the golden child. The favorite. The one who could set the house on fire and still get dessert afterward. I remember being maybe 9 years old, coming home with a perfect report card, straight A's across the board, not a single mark lower than excellent. I was glowing, clutching that paper like it was gold, like it finally meant they'd look at me differently. My dad barely looked up from his newspaper. "That's expected," he muttered. No smile, no hug, no pride. Meanwhile, Jason, who, mind you, had just bombed a math quiz that same week, got a full-blown family dinner for managing to improve his attitude in gym class. My mom made his favorite lasagna and told him how proud she was of his emotional growth. Emotional growth. He had thrown a dodgeball at a kid's face 3 days earlier. It never changed, not really. Every conversation at home somehow circled back to Jason. Jason's new internship, Jason's new girlfriend, Jason's latest big ideas, which, by the way, were mostly recycled nonsense he picked up from motivational YouTube videos. He had this way of speaking like he knew everything, puffed up with empty confidence that everyone just ate up. He'd say something vague like, "It's all about optimizing your network," and suddenly Dad was nodding like he'd just solved world hunger. I once presented a strategy that helped my department cut costs by 30%, and my father blinked and said, "That's nice, honey," but Jason just started a side hustle. It didn't matter how high I climbed, what I achieved, or how many nights I worked late, skipped vacations, missed birthdays. Jason would always be the sun, and I was just some orbiting satellite they forgot to name. I told myself for years that it didn't matter, that I didn't need their validation, that I could build a life on my own terms, without anyone's permission. But deep down, it chipped away at me, slowly, silently, like rust on iron. Still, I built myself brick by brick. I clawed my way into a competitive business program, worked 2 part-time jobs just to stay afloat, and graduated in the top 5%. Then came my first real job, entry-level, cold office, low pay, but I made it mine. I volunteered for every crap project, took every late shift, said yes to every opportunity no one else wanted. I became the person people turned to when things got messy, when deadlines collapsed, when clients yelled. I wasn't flashy. I was relentless. And slowly, people started to notice. Except my family. No matter how high I climbed, they just moved the goalpost further. When I bought my own condo at 29, my mom's first question was, "Is it in a safe neighborhood?" When I was promoted to regional manager, Dad chuckled and asked, "Does that mean you finally have people under you, or are you still answering phones?" I swear he thought that was a joke. Maybe it was. But the punchline was always me. Then came the offer. The real one. The one that made me stop and stare at my email for 10 minutes straight, rereading the subject line just to make sure it wasn't some kind of prank. The company was expanding fast, and they wanted me to lead a brand new division. Full autonomy. Full executive control. It wasn't just a promotion, it was a throne. CEO-level authority over a region projected to bring in millions in revenue over the next 2 years. All those years grinding in the shadows, and now I was finally being pulled into the spotlight. But not by them. By people who saw what I was worth. I should have just popped a bottle of champagne and moved on with my life. But I didn't. Something inside me, something quiet and angry and ancient, said no. Not this time. Not quietly. I wanted them to see it. I wanted them to see me. Not because I needed their applause anymore, but because I needed them to know they were wrong. That they'd been wrong for 30 years. So I threw a party. A big one. Not a cheap buffet in someone's backyard. A real event. Elegant, catered, suit and dress kind of evening. My assistant Ava helped plan it all down to the smallest detail. It wasn't just a celebration. It was a setup. A test. A final experiment to see how far they'd go to twist the spotlight away from me, even when it was burning bright and center. And I'll tell you this, they passed that test with flying colors. Or maybe I should say, they failed exactly as I knew they would. But that's the thing about people who think you'll always stay small. They never see it coming when you rise. And by the time they do, it's too damn late. The evening was the kind of elegant perfection that made even the cynics pause for a moment and admire. Polished marble floors under warm amber lighting, soft jazz humming through the speakers, crystal glasses clinking gently as guests chatted in tailored suits and satin dresses, and my assistant Ava making sure every hors d'oeuvre tray was passed around at precisely the right intervals. It was the kind of night I had dreamed about during all those years I stayed late at the office while Jason was out drinking beers and collecting participation trophies from life. I wanted this night to feel powerful, significant, not just for me, but for every woman who had ever been overlooked in favor of a louder, less capable man. For once, it was supposed to be about me, just me, standing in the center of the room without shrinking under someone else's shadow. I had spent weeks preparing for it, making sure every detail carried weight and elegance. The venue overlooked the city skyline from the 38th floor, and everything from the floral arrangements to the seating chart had been chosen with purpose and precision. Ava kept telling me to relax, to enjoy it, to soak in what I'd earned, but some part of me was still bracing for impact, like I knew better than to expect an uninterrupted moment of pride in the presence of my family. Still, I held on to hope. I had spent years convincing myself that if I just achieved enough, did enough, became enough, eventually, they'd have to see me. Maybe not love me more, but at least respect me. I was standing near the main table when I felt the click of the microphone being turned on. I turned toward the sound, thinking Ava was making a brief announcement or giving a cue for me to begin my thank you speech. But it wasn't Ava. It was my father. He stood there with his usual air of self-importance, holding his wine glass high like a judge delivering a final verdict. I saw the way people turned to him instinctively, how even Ava paused mid-step, confused. And before I could open my mouth, before I could even take a breath, he spoke, loudly, clearly, unapologetically. "Let's raise our glasses," he said, his voice cutting through the room like a blade wrapped in velvet, "to the real success in this family, Jason." Laughter erupted from the corner where my mother and a few of our cousins were sitting, sharp and bright like shattered glass in my ears. I felt the blood drain from my face, felt my hand gripping the stem of my champagne glass just a little too tightly. I didn't move. I didn't speak. I just stared straight ahead, trying to understand if I had actually heard what I thought I'd heard, or if I had somehow slipped into some surreal alternate version of my own celebration. Jason, ever the golden boy, leaned back in his seat with that same smug grin I had seen since we were children. He didn't even pretend to be surprised. He just soaked it all in like he was finally back in his rightful throne, as if my promotion, my years of work, my entire career had been nothing more than the opening act for his encore. "He's always had that spark," Dad added, chuckling like it was some kind of charming family joke. "Claire's done well too, of course, but Jason, well, Jason's something special, isn't he?" And just like that, the room shifted. People laughed politely, nodded, raised their glasses toward Jason like sheep following a whistle. What gutted me most wasn't the words themselves, though God knows they were enough to cut deep. It was the silence that followed, not from my father, but from everyone else. No one said a damn thing. Not one person tried to redirect the moment. Not one person looked uncomfortable. Not even my mother, who just tilted her head and gave me a tight-lipped smile as if to say, "You should be used to this by now." I stood there, invisible in my own spotlight, watching the glow shift onto someone who hadn't done a fraction of the work but was still somehow seen as the star of the show. And I wish I could tell you I said something sharp in that moment, that I delivered a mic drop comeback, or stood up and flipped the table, or walked out with my head held high. But I didn't. I stayed right there, rooted to the floor, smiling politely like I was the damn hostess of someone else's party. I clinked glasses when people offered their congratulations, accepted hollow compliments with a nod, and swallowed the bitter taste in my throat with every sip of champagne. Not because I was weak. Not because I didn't care. But because I was planning. Because I was listening. Because I was watching every single face in that room and tucking away every smirk, every glance, every dismissive comment like ammunition in a locked drawer. By the time dessert came around, my body was still there, poised, polished, composed, but my mind was somewhere else entirely. Somewhere cold and sharp and calculating. That toast hadn't just bruised me, it cracked something deep inside, something old and tired and quietly simmering for years. And once it cracked, something else started to pour through, something dangerous, something unstoppable. They thought they had stolen my moment. They thought they had dimmed my light again. But what they didn't know was that the spotlight they hijacked was already wired to a fuse, and I was the one holding the match. The laughter still hung faintly in the air like a stale perfume no one wanted to admit was lingering, as people shifted back into their seats, sipping champagne and pretending everything had gone smoothly. As if my father's speech hadn't just turned the entire evening into a shrine to my brother's mediocrity. I could see some guests awkwardly glancing at me, probably wondering if I'd eventually make a toast of my own, or whether I'd simply smile through my humiliation like a well-trained daughter who knew her place. My fingers twitched around the stem of my glass, the ice in my veins a direct contrast to the warm smiles and clinks echoing from every direction. But then, like the sound of a key turning in a lock, the double doors to the venue opened, and in walked Ava. She wasn't flustered or apologetic for being late, nor did she shrink herself the way assistants often do in rooms full of executives and egos. No, she walked with sharp heels and sharper intention, her stride measured, her expression unreadable except for the tiniest flicker of something in her eyes, something between satisfaction and anticipation. In her hand was a black leather folder, thick and clean, with a golden clasp that glinted under the chandelier lights. Every step she took felt choreographed, not rushed or random, but deliberate, like she had been waiting for precisely this moment, and she wasn't going to waste a second of it. When she reached me, she didn't whisper. She didn't lean in discreetly or shuffle awkwardly like she was delivering some minor paperwork. She placed the folder gently on the table beside me, met my eyes without hesitation, and said, loud enough for the entire room to hear, "Congratulations, CEO." That one sentence dropped into the atmosphere like a stone into still water, sharp, sudden, irreversible. Every conversation died mid-sentence. Every fork froze halfway to every mouth. All the smiles melted off faces like wax under a flame. My mother's wine glass tilted slightly in her fingers, and even Jason sat up straighter, his confident posture suddenly faltering as confusion began to bloom across his face. I didn't speak immediately. I let the silence breathe. I let them stew in that unfamiliar stillness, the kind where you realize something massive has just shifted beneath your feet, but you don't yet know which direction the ground is going to crack. Slowly, deliberately, I opened the folder, flipping back the cover to reveal the contents within, page after page of finalized documents, signed and sealed, the culmination of months of behind-the-scenes meetings, strategy sessions, and boardroom negotiations. And there it was, my name, printed in bold under the title Chief Executive Officer, followed by the name of our newly launched regional branch, a powerhouse project the company had been assembling in secret while competitors remained oblivious. But the real bombshell hadn't even been spoken aloud yet, and I could feel the weight of it pressing against my tongue. This wasn't just a promotion. It wasn't a step up the corporate ladder or a symbolic title to make me feel included. It was a power move, a calculated shift in structure that gave me control over the region's operational hub, which included, unbeknownst to most of the room, the outsourcing and management systems currently used by Jason's company. His entire operation, the one my family constantly bragged about, would soon fall under my jurisdiction. The contracts had already been drafted. The transition had already been scheduled. All that remained was the formality of public announcement, and I had just lit the first fuse. Jason laughed nervously, the kind of laugh people force when they're unsure if the joke is on them or if they're still in on it. "Wait, CO?" he said, turning to our father, then back to me. "Like, real CO? Not regional manager, not executive director, but actual CO." I looked him in the eye, steady and unblinking, and nodded. "Yes, Jason," I said, my voice calm and even. "Real CEO. The kind you'll be sending quarterly reports to by the end of this fiscal year." The expression on his face didn't shift all at once. It fractured slowly, piece by piece, like watching a mask crack under heat. He opened his mouth to speak again, but nothing came out. My father, who just minutes earlier had been basking in the glow of his own cheap punchline, sat rigid, his complexion visibly pale, jaw clenched so tight I could almost hear his teeth grind. My mother, still holding that glass, finally blinked and muttered something unintelligible, but even her usual grace couldn't cover the fact that the spotlight had finally, irrevocably, swung in my direction. And I didn't gloat. I didn't smirk. I didn't deliver a speech or bask in their stunned silence. I simply closed the folder, stood tall, and raised my glass, not in toast, not in spite, but in quiet acknowledgement of every damn step it took to get here. I let them sit with their discomfort. Let them taste the sour flavor of their own dismissal. Let them choke on the arrogance they had fed me for 3 decades. Because this wasn't revenge yet. No, this was only the beginning. The real reckoning hadn't even started. But now, finally, they knew I wasn't just in the room anymore. I was the one running it. The strange part wasn't how loud the party had been, it was how loud the silence afterward became, the kind of silence that echoes in empty inboxes and unanswered group chats, the kind that weighs on your chest even when no one's saying a word. There were no follow-up messages from my parents, no warm congratulations sent later as some half-hearted attempt to make things right, no casual phone calls from my mother pretending everything had been a misunderstanding. There was just a hollow stillness that wrapped itself around me like a velvet rope, elegant and quiet, but unmistakably meant to keep me separate. And I welcomed it. I let it sit there between us, thick and intentional, because for the first time in my life, I didn't feel the urge to fix it, to smooth things over, or to make myself smaller so they could feel comfortable again. Jason's message came 2 days later, a text that tried so hard to sound casual it practically bled desperation. "Hey, just wanted to say congrats again. Huge news. Proud of you." I stared at it for a moment, not because I didn't know how to respond, but because I already knew exactly how I would. I didn't reply with emojis or exclamation points or a polite thank you. Instead, I drafted a brief, cold message from my company email account. It began with "Dear Mr. Langston" and ended with "Looking forward to our collaboration." No warmth. No sisterly tone. Just clean, clipped professionalism, the kind that makes people realize there's no door left open for familiarity anymore. But the real unveiling wasn't the silence or the emails, it was what came next, the part they never saw coming because they never bothered to look past their own reflections. You see, buried in the fine print of that beautiful, pristine CO contract was a little clause most people wouldn't think twice about, a clause about internal restructuring within all partnered departments as part of the merger's second phase rollout. And Jason's department, that precious little sandbox he'd been playing in for years while pretending to be indispensable, was first on the list. Not because I asked for it, not because I manipulated it into being, but because corporate efficiency demands results, and sentimentality has no place in profit margins. The restructuring plan was already underway when the HR reports came across my desk, and I didn't hesitate for a second. Jason's role, once proudly labeled as senior operations lead, had already been flagged as redundant, his performance scores barely scraping average in the latest quarterly reviews. There were 3 candidates being considered to replace him, all younger, sharper, and significantly more qualified. And guess who had final approval over the new hire recommendations? I didn't gloat when I saw his name on the list of proposed transfers. I didn't laugh when I saw the suggested new title, Support Operations Coordinator. It wasn't a firing. It was a demotion. The kind that strips a man of his illusion without taking away his paycheck. The kind that forces you to sit at the same table, but 3 seats down, where no one's listening anymore. He didn't hear about it officially until the following Monday, when the department heads received internal memos outlining the new structure. I imagine the panic must have hit him like a cold wave, not a crush, but a slow, creeping chill that starts in your spine and spreads into your gut when you realize the ground you thought was solid is suddenly sinking beneath you. He called that evening, his voice shaking beneath a poor attempt at calm, starting the conversation with a laugh that didn't quite land. "Claire, this is crazy. You're not really going through with this, right? I mean, come on. I'm your brother." I let his words hang in the air for a moment, not because I needed time to think, but because I wanted him to hear the silence before I answered. "You should have raised your glass for me when you had the chance," I said, every syllable clean and sharp, like a blade that had been waiting years to be drawn. He stammered something about family, about loyalty, about how this wasn't what he expected, and for once, he was right. It wasn't what he expected. Because he never expected me to rise above him. He never expected me to hold the pen that rewrote his job description. He never expected me to become the storm after decades of being dismissed as a breeze. And maybe that makes me cold. Maybe some people would say I should have shown more grace, that I should have taken the high road, that success should be its own reward. But let me tell you something about the high road. It's lonely, and most of the time, it leads you right back to the same place where people keep stepping on you. I didn't climb all those years just to hand my power back to the same hands that once clapped louder for my brother's mediocrity than for my own triumphs. I wasn't cruel. I was precise. I didn't humiliate him publicly. I didn't make speeches about revenge, and I didn't need to twist the knife. I just handed him the cold, clinical reality of consequence. He wanted a seat at the table, and he still had one. It just wasn't at the head anymore. And if he wanted to keep it, he'd have to work for it, not coast on last names and empty charisma. The thing is, they all taught me how to stay quiet, how to stay pleasant, how to stay small. And now, they were watching me unlearn every one of those lessons, one strategic move at a time. Word travels quickly when people start to realize that the person they've been dismissing for decades suddenly holds all the cards. And let me tell you, the shift in tone from my so-called family was nothing short of theatrical. The same people who used to shrug off my achievements or brush them aside with backhanded compliments were suddenly full of warm words, nostalgic memories, and a suspicious amount of performative pride. It was like watching actors scrambling to rewrite their lines mid-scene, hoping the audience wouldn't notice that the plot had completely changed while they were still stuck in the old script. My phone, once eerily silent during moments that actually mattered, was suddenly lighting up with messages that reeked of panic disguised as affection. My father was the first to reach out, though not with an apology, not a real one, anyway. He called the next morning with a forced chuckle in his voice, like he was trying to shake off the awkwardness by pretending none of it had been serious. "Hey, kiddo," he said, like that word had ever held warmth between us. "That toast the other night, it was just a joke, you know? I didn't mean anything by it. We were all just having fun." I let his words hang in the air, not out of confusion, but because I wanted him to hear the silence he had never allowed me to fill before. I didn't scream. I didn't argue. I didn't try to make him understand. I simply said, in the calmest tone I could muster, "Funny how you only call when you realize I hold the power now." He didn't have a response to that. He hung up. Just like that. No goodbye. No denial. Just a deadline and a louder silence than before. A few days later, my mother appeared at my office without warning, stepping into the space like she had every right to be there, like she hadn't sat silently beside him at that party, laughing along as my dignity was shoved to the side for the sake of another Jason highlight reel. She didn't even sit down right away. She just stood in front of my desk, clutching her purse like it might shield her from the consequences of years she'd spent choosing one child's ego over the other's spirit. "Claire," she began, her voice soft but sharp in that passive-aggressive way mothers master when they want to guilt you without saying it outright. "I think you've made your point." I raised an eyebrow but said nothing. "But he's your brother," she continued, placing extra weight on the word as if biology was supposed to erase history. "Families don't do this to each other." I leaned back slowly in my chair, letting her words hang in the space between us like smoke from a fire she pretended not to start. "Exactly," I said, keeping my voice steady. "Families don't do this to each other. But you all did it to me for 30 years. You just didn't think I'd ever get the chance to return the favor." Her lips parted slightly, but she said nothing. What could she say? That she hadn't known? That it wasn't intentional? That somehow all those years of choosing silence over support were just unfortunate accidents? I didn't let her pretend innocence. Not this time. And here's the part that really gets people, the part that makes them whisper behind closed doors and call me cold when they think I'm not listening. I didn't fire Jason. I didn't throw him out or publicly shame him or tear down what little pride he had left in front of a boardroom full of witnesses. No, I made him stay. I made him walk into the office every morning knowing that the sister he used to mock now signed off on every single one of his project proposals. I made him sit through meetings where I was the one leading strategy, where people hung on my every word while his ideas were politely skimmed over or redirected. I made him exist beneath the weight of my presence, not because I needed him to suffer, but because I wanted him to really see, what it meant to be underestimated by someone who refused to stay small. There's something more cutting than punishment, more lasting than vengeance, and that's the quiet, constant reminder that you failed to recognize greatness when it stood right in front of you. Every time he walks past my office door, every time he hears my name spoken with authority, every time he has to address me in a professional tone, it chips away at the illusion he built for himself all those years. The one where he was the star and I was just background noise. Some people think revenge is about destruction, about burning bridges and watching others fall, but I've learned something far more powerful. Real revenge isn't loud. It isn't flashy. Its presence, quiet, undeniable, and immovable. Being there, in the place they said you'd never reach, doing the very things they said you weren't capable of, becoming exactly the person they spent years convincing you could never be, that's the kind of revenge that leaves scars long after the flames die down. And I didn't do it out of spite. I did it to reclaim what was always mine but was buried beneath years of their noise. I didn't need to scream to be heard. I just had to rise high enough that even their silence couldn't drown me out anymore. It happened quietly, in the way most full-circle moments do, not with fanfare, not with confetti or thunder, but with a stillness so sharp it cut through the noise of everything that had come before it. A few months after the party, after the restructuring, after Jason's demotion had settled in like a slow, humiliating bruise across his pride, the company hosted a formal gala, an end-of-quarter celebration for executives, partners, and top stakeholders. It was the kind of event where people dressed in black ties and fake smiles, where praise was currency and perception was king. But this time, unlike all the times before, the attention wasn't drifting in Jason's direction. This time, they all knew whose hand held the steering wheel. I walked into that room wearing a black satin dress that fit like a second skin, my presence turning heads not because of the dress, but because of the authority that moved with me. I didn't have to try to be seen anymore. I didn't have to fight for space at the table or elbow my way into conversations. I was the conversation now. People stood when I approached. They smiled wide, offered praise, tried to insert themselves into my orbit, hoping to stay relevant. Funny how quickly people change their tune when power shifts hands, how loyalty always seems to trail behind influence like a dog on a leash. Jason was there too, of course, lingering near the back, no longer the center of attention, no longer the headline. He wore a suit that didn't quite fit, standing beside people who now barely acknowledged him. He still tried to carry himself like nothing had changed, like he wasn't standing in the shadow of the very person he used to talk over at family dinners. But you could see it, the tension in his jaw, the stiffness in his posture, the way his eyes kept flicking toward me when he thought I wasn't looking. I saw it all. And I didn't look away. As the evening reached its peak, the MC took the stage and began announcing the year's milestones, highlighting each division's successes and naming the top-performing leaders. My name was called last, a deliberate choice, a strategic one, because nothing creates more impact than a closing act that leaves a room stunned. When I stepped forward to accept my recognition, the applause didn't feel hollow or forced like it had in the past. It felt earned. It felt like the sound of every sleepless night, every ignored achievement, every time I swallowed pride just to stay focused, finally echoing back at full volume. I turned to the audience, held my glass high, and let the moment stretch. Then I spoke, my voice steady, clear, and sharp enough to cut straight through the air. "I'd like to make a toast," I said, scanning the room slowly, pausing for just half a breath when my eyes landed on my father, who sat near the center, face unreadable. To those who doubted me, I continued, to those who clapped louder for others while I stayed in the shadows, and to those who taught me exactly what it means to stand alone, I raise this glass to you. There was a beat of silence, just long enough for the meaning to sink in before the room erupted again in applause, louder than before, some people cheering, others nodding solemnly, while a few exchanged awkward glances, trying to decide whether to celebrate or squirm. I didn't care. I wasn't speaking to all of them. I was speaking to the ghosts in my past, the ones still breathing, still sitting among the crowd, pretending not to feel the sting in every word. After the toast, I didn't linger. I didn't need to. I had already said everything that needed to be said. As I walked back to my seat, I passed Jason, who didn't even try to hide the look in his eyes, a flicker of resentment, a shadow of guilt, and something else, something heavier than either of those. Regret. Later that night, as the event wound down and the crowd began to scatter, my father approached me alone. He looked older somehow, smaller than I remembered, like power had been the thing holding him upright all those years, and now that it was gone, gravity had taken over. He opened his mouth like he wanted to say something, maybe an apology, maybe an excuse, but I didn't give him the chance. I just gave him a long, quiet look and walked away without a word. Because the truth is, I didn't need his apology. I didn't need any of theirs. What I needed was to prove, to myself more than anyone, that I could rise, even when everything in my own bloodline tried to hold me down. That I could become undeniable in the face of silence, invisibility, and dismissal. That I could rewrite the story they tried to script for me since the day I was born. So, here's my final thought, and maybe it's a question too, because not everything in life comes with a neat little ending. What would you have done if your family kept erasing you? If every accomplishment was met with indifference? If every room you walked into was already wired to ignore you? Would you rise quietly? Or would you wait for the right moment? And raise your glass one final time? You tell me.